If writing a recommendation report feels intimidating, it's probably because you were just told to make a recommendation, as if that instruction explains how much judgment is allowed, how certain the language should be, or how to balance authority with evidence. When those expectations aren't made explicit, it's very easy for the report to go south fast. So this lecture exists to prevent any confusion before it starts, and it builds on work done elsewhere on my channel, as I have everything you need to know about report writing fundamentals, audience and purpose, problem definition, scope and limitations, and so much more. So be sure to check those out if you need additional resources. The focus here, though, is what a recommendation report is, how it differs from an informational report, and how to write a decision section that moves from explanation into judgment in a way that works in real professional settings rather than just sounding good on the page. If you're new here, my name is Dr. Whitney Kosters, and I'm a professor of English here to help you with all things related to writing and literature, so be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out on future lectures. Now, this video is dedicated to recommendation reports because they are among the most common professional documents people are asked to write, but they're also among the least clearly explained. They appear across business, healthcare, government, education, nonprofit, and technical fields, often under time pressure and with real consequences attached. Understanding how they function replaces guesswork with deliberate, defensible decision-making, which is absolutely crucial in the professional world. So let's start with the core idea. A recommendation report exists because a decision can no longer be avoided. Continuing as things are is no longer neutral, and choosing not to act has consequences just as much as taking action. These consequences may involve money, safety, staffing, policy, timelines, public trust, long-term risk, or some combination of these. The role of the report, then, is to make the decision deliberate rather than reactive, and defensible rather than improvised. And it's this purpose that distinguishes a recommendation report from an informational report. You'll remember from my lecture on informational reports that they exist to establish shared understanding. They explain what's happening, what patterns emerge when evidence is considered together, and where uncertainty remains. So, an informational report's responsibility is clarity and accuracy. A recommendation report begins where that work ends because it assumes shared understanding and moves into judgment. In this report, the central question shifts from what's happening to what should be done given what's known, what's constrained, and what's at stake. So the report is no longer primarily about explanation, it's about responsibility. Because recommendation reports justify action, they carry lasting weight. Once written, they may be circulated, summarized, forwarded, quoted, or revisited long after the original moment has passed. They're often used later to explain why a particular course of action was chosen, why alternatives were rejected, or whether a decision was reasonable given what was known at the time. It's for that reason that recommendation reports cannot rely on implication. Their reasoning must always be visible. Now, most people have already encountered recommendation reports without realizing it, which is part of why this genre often feels unfamiliar, even though it's everywhere. When an organization evaluates whether to replace outdated software and produces a document comparing vendors, costs, risks, and timelines before naming a preferred option, that document is a recommendation report. When a hospital committee reviews safety data and staffing constraints before changing a patient intake procedure, they are reading a recommendation report. And when a city analyzes traffic data, accident patterns, and budget limits before approving a new intersection design, the document is, yes, a recommendation report. In each case, the report doesn't exist to explore ideas or display research. It exists to justify action in a way that other people can rely on later. Once that purpose is clear, the structure of a recommendation report actually becomes easier to understand. Now, formats vary across organizations, but effective recommendation reports tend to include the same functional parts because readers need the same kinds of information in order to act responsibly. What matters is not memorizing a template, but understanding what each part is responsible for doing. So a recommendation report typically opens by establishing the decision context. This section explains what decision the report exists to support and why the decision is being considered now rather than later. It briefly situates the situation and surfaces the stakes without turning into a full background narrative. By the end of this section, readers should understand why a decision is required and what pressure is driving it. Next, the report defines the problem and its scope. This is where the framing of the situation becomes explicit. Scope clarifies what the recommendation can reasonably claim and what it can't. And as I've mentioned many times before in other lectures, if scope remains implicit, readers often assume the recommendation applies more broadly than intended, which is never good. The report then establishes evaluation criteria. Now, criteria are the standards the decision must satisfy. They're not stylistic preferences or persuasive language. They are the requirements against which options will be judged. Common criteria include cost, feasibility, time, compliance, safety, effectiveness, equity, sustainability, staffing impact, implementation complexity, and risk. Now keep in mind that not every decision relies on the same criteria and that variation is intentional. Criteria emerge from the decision context itself, and naming them explicitly shows readers how options are being evaluated and what counts as success or failure. With the criteria in place, the report defines the options under consideration. Now, options must be described as concrete courses of action rather than vague labels. A reader should always be able to picture what each option would involve if implemented. If your options are abstract or compressed, later evaluation is going to feel arbitrary, so always be mindful of that. The next section is the evaluation section, and that compares the options using the established criteria. Strong evaluation applies the same standards consistently, and it explains how each option performs under those conditions. It doesn't pretend that all criteria matter equally if they don't. If certain constraints dominate because of risk, regulation, or feasibility, that weighting needs to be stated rather than implied. All of this work leads to the most consequential part of the report, the decision section. Now, the decision section is where the report stops explaining and begins owning judgment. It's not an academic conclusion and not a place to reopen analysis. It is a record of judgment made under constraint. And this is actually where a lot of recommendation reports start slipping or even fail outright, even when the research and evaluation are solid, because the decision can easily get delayed, softened, or buried. Readers reach the end unsure what action is being recommended, or they infer a recommendation the report never clearly states. And when that happens, responsibility shifts to the reader, which defeats the entire purpose of the document. So a strong decision section follows a deliberate sequence. First, the recommended action is named directly and early. At this point, many writers get uncomfortable making a clear call, so they often soften the recommendation instead of just stating it directly. Phrases such as, "this report suggests," "it may be worth considering," or "one possible option is," force readers to guess what is actually being proposed. Remember, clarity doesn't require aggressive language or false certainty, just commitment to stating the recommendation plainly. For example, the report recommends expanding the program in phases over 12 months, beginning with the highest demand locations. Or the report recommends adopting option B and discontinuing the current process by the end of the fiscal year. With clear and assertive language like this, readers should know exactly what action is being recommended within the first few sentences. Second, the decision section explains why this option rises above the others based on the established criteria. And this is where interpretation matters the most. A common mistake is repetition because writers tend to restate findings or summarize earlier sections instead of just explaining how the criteria interact to support the decision. Always remember that the decision section is a synthesis of reasoning and not a recap. As a reminder, synthesis just means showing how multiple considerations work together. One option may be similar in cost to another, but better satisfy feasibility constraints. Another may produce faster short-term results while increasing long-term risk in a way that conflicts with stated priorities. This is also where weighting becomes visible. If safety or compliance outweighs speed or convenience, that logic must be stated explicitly. A strong decision section identifies what the recommendation doesn't resolve, what risks remain, and what assumptions it depends on. It also explains why those limits are acceptable given the situation and stakes. Unlike common belief, transparency of this kind doesn't weaken a recommendation. It actually signals responsible judgment. Now, there are clear limits on what belongs in a decision section. It shouldn't introduce new evidence because all evidence should already appear earlier in the report. It also shouldn't rely on urgent language or emotional pressure, and it should never overpromise outcomes. Remember that recommendation reports are always meant to justify action. They are never meant to guarantee results. When written well, a decision section feels earned. This is also why recommendation reports tend to show up later in professional workflows, after planning, research, findings, and evaluation have already been done. Readers can trace the reasoning backward through the report and see how the recommendation follows from the criteria, the evaluation of options, and the constraints shaping the situation. That traceability is what makes the report usable later when the decision is questioned or revisited. So a final revision check helps ensure the section is doing its job. Ask yourself if a reader could answer these questions without guessing. What action is being recommended? Why was this option chosen over the others? What trade-offs are being accepted? And what uncertainty remains? And why is the recommendation still reasonable? If those answers are clear, then you know that your report is supporting judgment, documenting reasoning, and making responsibility visible on the page. In other words, it's doing its job. If this breakdown was helpful, I'll remind you that I have a full playlist on this channel devoted to report writing, from foundational concepts through planning, research, findings, visuals, recommendations, executive summaries, and revision. It's designed to be used as a reference rather than watched only once. As always, thank you so much for joining me here today and spending a few moments of your time with me. I do really appreciate it. I will see you guys in the next video. Be well.